Historically, boss encounters are where the artistic visions of game developers are allowed to truly bloom. Intense encounters there to provide the player with particularly dazzling, difficult, or sometimes even sickening beings to face off against, be they human, machine, or monster. I've played countless games with great boss and enemy designs over the years. Designs that just stick with you due to how aesthetically pleasing they are to behold, or even how damn out there they are. Designs where you don't understand how someone could have even came up with what you're seeing. But in my eyes, FromSoft are the undisputed kings of sick, detailed boss designs, perfectly complementing the significant difficulty and gameplay depth of their games, which brings us onto the subject of this video where I rank what I consider to be the top 15 sickest Soulsborne boss designs, but specifically for Armoured bosses, and by that I mean bosses who wear an armour set that you the player can obtain and wear. I'm talking bosses like the Penetrator from Demon Souls, the Throne Defender from Dark Souls 2, or even the Dancer of the Boreal Valley from Dark Souls 3, because despite her size you can still obtain her armour, whereas say Fort of the Boreal Valley would not be a suitable candidate, because despite how insanely sick he looks, you cannot get his armour. Fret not though, because I'll soon be releasing a monster edition of this video where I rank the 15 sickest monster boss designs of these games, so stay tuned for that. Also, I do have to specify that the actual quality of the boss fights are irrelevant to my rankings. I'm purely ranking them on things like their aesthetics and associated lore, not how fun and interesting they are to fight. If you like the video, hey, why not subscribe to the channel? I make fun videos about great games. And finally, please allow me to give a fond thank you to my kind patrons for their support for the channel. And on that note, let's begin with boss number 15. To kick off the list, I have the Crucible Knight from Elden Ring, a boss that most players will first encounter very early on at the Stormhill Everjail, only to most likely get utterly annihilated before perhaps returning much later with better gear and higher stats, to just scrape a victory, not unlike most folks experience with the Tree Sentinel. Just like Elden Ring does with several of its bosses, you also see these formidable knights appear at key points elsewhere throughout the world as mini-bosses of sorts, such as at the nearby Stormvale Castle, the Siofra Aqueduct, and in crumbling Faram Azula, though at the end of the Arise the Hero's Grave a named one can be found, Crucible Knight Ordovis, said to be one of the two honoured as foremost among Godfrey's knights, with the other being Crucible Knight Siluria, who stands sentinel by the remains of a large tree in Deeproot Depths. Although their designs share the same primordial gold coloration, being darker and more red tinted compared to the purer gold associated with the Erd tree, the armour designs and weapon choices of the two are quite different, with the Siluria variants boasting a horned helm instead of that sharp as hell axe design worn by the Ordovis variants. The Crucible horn shields used by the latter might just be the single most awesome looking shield in Elden Ring, though it's a toss up between either that or the Dragonclaw shield used by Draconic Tree Sentinels. I can't decide. Of the two variants, it's specifically the Axe Helm one I've picked for number 15 in my list, and its sword and shield are a big reason for that. I've never quite loved the Siluria Tree Spear. It's one of those weapons where I like the idea behind it, that being that it was modelled after the form of the Crucible itself, being imbued with its ancient holy essence and dealing equal parts physical and holy damage, but even so I've always thought it just looked a wee bit silly, like someone's attached a bunch of bananas to a long pole. Perhaps the primordial form of the Erd tree is actually that of the banana. How's that for lore? That luscious, lustrous hunk of red tinted metal used by Ordovis is much more to my standards, and I've always loved the axe form of their helm, presumably shaped so in tribute to the weapon preference of their Lord Godfrey. Of course, the crucible aspect of these enemies is a significant part of what makes them so compelling. You see a lot of knights throughout Elden Ring, usually boasting different armour designs and weapons depending on which region, fort or castle they are based in, but for as impressive and intimidating as their designs often are, they're largely perfectly understandable and conventional. But the Crucible Knights are far more mysterious and thus have far more presence thanks to the distinctive design and coloration of their weapons and armour. There are more facets to them still though, those being the aspects of the Crucible, abilities which briefly alter their physical forms to allow for powerful attacks based on tail, horn or breath, though some knights even boast the ability to sprout holy spectral wings before rushing in for a devastating attack, with the form of these special attacks all being very significant to the history of the lands between. The most unloved and unwanted beings in the lands between are omens and the misbegotten, which themselves have these physical aspects of the crucible around their bodies, said to be hangovers from a time before the Erdtree, and thus a time which does not fit neatly into the framework of the Golden Order. You can even encounter a Crucible Knight fighting alongside a Leonine Misbegotten at Redmane Castle, which further adds to how much they stand out when compared to near any other knight in the lands between, most of whom would sooner be seen butchering a Misbegotten rather than being allied to them, perhaps with the exception of the Knights of the Haligtree, who are far more welcoming of the world's less fortunate beings. The armour and weapons alone of the Crucible Knights are enough for them to land a spot as one of my favourite armoured boss designs, but there's so much more to them even beyond that. A hidden history that significantly elevates them above all the game's other knights. Next up, we have the Looking Glass Knight from Dark Souls 2. The second entry in the Dark Souls trilogy may indeed be the most maligned game in FromSoft's catalogue of games over the past 15 years, either fairly or unfairly depending on who you ask, but as far as its armoured enemies and boss designs go, well, honestly I think for the most part it is top tier, and I do not say that lightly. One common criticism levelled at the game when it was first released was how so many of its bosses were just dudes in armour, compared to the generally more demonic enemies encountered in Dark Souls 1. But personally, that was just never an issue for me, because I happen to love large men in armour. In the game, I mean, not in real life. At the very end of Drangleic Castle, after the encounter with another incredible looking pair of bosses in their own right, those being the Dragon Riders, and after a horrible corridor full of those stone horse soldier things, you come face to mast face with the Looking Glass Knight, formerly known as the Mirror Knight, in fact, back when Dark Souls 2 was first revealed to the public and press. Not sure why they changed the name. Screw its name though, it's the Looking Glass Knight's aesthetics that I've always loved, having a uniquely Roman style to it, not to mention its mask, which has always reminded me of Tigris the Gaul from the movie Gladiator. See, the aspect I most love about this boss's design is how heavy and implacable it feels. Like most enemies in Dark Souls 2, it really doesn't move particularly fast, but its attacks are deliberate and impactful, making the screen shake with every swing and slam from its thorned greatsword, and that constant neutral, eyeless expression gives the boss a certain calm, even robotic look, especially when coupled with its size, being twice the height of the player, not to mention its nearly entirely silver armour. Knight enemies are very rarely all that expressive in FromSoft games, and by that I mean it tends to feel less like you're fighting a person wearing armour and more like you're fighting the armour itself, which is literally the case for certain enemies, but the Looking Glass Knight's design manages to make it feel like you are fighting some sort of person in armour, except one completely beyond any sort of reason, logic or even speech, as it stares at you from seemingly empty eye holes, existing only to prevent any undead from passing beyond the King's Passage, down into the Shrine of Amana, and then further down still into the Undead Crypt, where Venric awaits as a shambling hollow. You get the feeling that another several centuries could pass, and the Looking Glass Knight would still be standing here, armour perpetually polished to a mirror sheen, standing sentinel with its enormous mirror shield, capable of blocking any and all damage and also serving as a literal passage to another world. And now we have a fan favourite, with Knight Artorias from Dark Souls 1. Of course, you hear tales of the bravery and heroism of the Wolf Knight throughout the base game, and then more still in the early stages of the DLC, but rather than this culminating in any sort of grand meeting with the legendary Abyss Walker in his prime, you instead encounter only a corrupted, broken beast of a man, his mind having been thoroughly eroded by his time in the chasm below Ulasil. With Artorias having been lost to the Abyss, his armour has a very unique, ruined character, with the player only being able to infer what it may have looked like before, based on the frayed, dark-drenched blue cape which now hangs in tatters. Even so, the ragged, well-worn aspect of it, if anything, makes it look even cooler, being far lighter and slimmer than most other Dark Souls armour sets, allowing for all manner of acrobatics and rapid movements around the arena. The same sort of light armour style would be adopted by Dark Souls 3's Abyss Watchers, who of course move in a very similar manner to Artorias, with them also fighting back against the corruption of the Abyss before tragically and irreversibly becoming tainted by it. Artorias was known as the Wolf Knight, of course, and indeed in Dark Souls 3, where you can also get his gear, he's only known as the Wolf Knight, with his true name having long since been forgotten by that point, with only the legend remaining, though he doesn't much resemble a wolf in his appearance, with his helm always having seemed far more bird-like to me, resembling a large beak. Instead, the wolf aspect more comes from his companion, the great grey wolf Sif, who would of course guard his friend and master's grave in Darkroot Garden for centuries to come. Sif is also related to another aspect of his visual design, that being his broken left arm. After descending down into the chasm of the abyss, Artorias gave Sif his great shield so as to allow his canine companion to escape the chasm alive and untainted, though by the time you find the shield, its form has been heavily corrupted, appearing as the far less refined cleansing great shield. Without the aid of a shield, however, Artorias would go on to sustain a brutal injury to his left arm, presumably in an encounter with Manus, the most powerful creature within the chasm. This one-handed aspect to his appearance really does a lot to make his design and movements so distinctive, with his shattered arm always just hanging down uselessly, really pushing the idea that you are fighting the battered and corrupted remains of an old hero. Artorias is a great example of a boss's tragic backstory really complementing its visual design to create a powerful and memorable encounter, and this only increasingly becomes the case as the fight drags on, with Artorias becoming progressively more corrupted, roaring in tortured outrage at his fate and leaving behind pools and splatters of dark purple abyss slime as he darts and flips around the arena. At number 12, I have selected Dragon Slayer Ornstein from Dark Souls 1. I know the actual boss encounter is against both Ornstein and Smo, but they're both different characters with very different designs, and so should be considered separately. I keenly recall that first time I walked through the enormous fog gate at the end of Anor Londo Castle, feeling nervous as hell at what sort of frightful boss might close out such a glorious but dangerous level, and indeed, upon catching sight of the imposing figure of Smo standing ominously at the far end of the hall, followed by the comparatively smaller figure of Dragon Slayer Ornstein jumping down from the balcony, I realised that I was correct to feel nervous, because these two goofballs turned out to be very tough indeed, but also very, very sick. I said that Ornstein was smaller, but really that's only when you compare him to his giant companion, because he's still around twice the height of the player, and that's only in phase 1. If you're one of the small percentage of people on Earth who prefer to take down Smo first so as to take on Super Ornstein in phase 2, he turns into an absolute giant in a way that I've always found unaccountably disturbing. I mean, as far as I can tell, his features are identical. The only difference is that he's bigger, like they've click and dragged him or something, and it terrifies the shit out of me. We just spoke about Artorias, one of the 4 Knights of Gwyn, as indicated by the wolf ring you can find in Darkroot Garden, but Ornstein himself is another such honoured knight, as indicated by the Leo ring which only drops if you beat Super Ornstein. The design of his armour is itself made to resemble a lion, an effect enhanced by its grand gold coloration, though of course it's not big cats which gave Ornstein his namesake, but rather big dragons. Those legendarily formidable beasts which Ornstein slayed by burying his lightning spear deep in their hides. Lightning is of course the ultimate weakness of dragons and was key to Lord Gwyn's victory against them in the Age of Ancients. Great wee bit of environmental storytelling to add to the badassery of Ornstein's character is the room earlier on in the castle filled with dragon or perhaps drake heads mounted on the wall. Lore aside though, one of the things I've always most enjoyed about Ornstein's design is how elaborate it is, for want of a better adjective. It's ridiculously detailed, with so many unnecessary edges, grooves and points, which I can't imagine offer any tactical advantage unless you were planning on selling it off as a collector's item. But it doesn't matter, because it looks really stylish, excellently complementing the more brutal and monstrous design of Smo. For number 11 we're back to Dark Souls 2 again, though certainly not for the last time in this video, presenting the Pursuer. You first see this hulking cursed knight in the Forest of Fallen Giants, where it abruptly drops down for a challenging one-time encounter, though it does appear as a regular boss further on in the level. Even when you beat it here though, it certainly won't be the final encounter, because as you traverse other levels throughout the game, especially the Lost Bastille, the Pursuer will silently materialise up out of the ground in a haze of dark curse smoke, and you can even face off against 2 of them at the same time at Drang Lake Castle on New Game Plus. Look, The Pursuer is a boss where if you want to be reductive as hell, you could just point at it and laugh and say, oh look, it's another big dude in armour. Boring. But god damn, this is a sick big dude in armour and very detailed. For a start, his, or rather its, main armour piece is adorned with several screaming face-shaped indentations, though rather than this being a mere decoration, these are heavily implied to be the souls of his many undead victims that the Pursuer has hunted down, still suffering within that hulking iron armour, screaming for release. It also carries an arsenal of weapons in a row of fabric strung across its back, though the only weapon it ever actually uses is its ultra greatsword, again implying that these weapons are not for use, but rather they've been collected from its victims. I earlier spoke about how the Looking Glass Knight had a nearly robotic feel to its movements and attacks, but the Pursuer has its own uniquely menacing aura. The item description of its greatsword reads, "The Pursuer hunts down those branded by the curse, as if each undead soul that he claims will atone one of his sins." But by the time we're fighting it here, and in all future encounters, it's as if there's barely even a person inside at all anymore, but rather it has been completely overcome by the curse to the point where it's just a darkly possessed set of armour. The single eye slot of its visor really lends itself to the idea that you're not dealing with a person anymore, and if you manage to get tagged by its glowing curse impale attack, it gets a special buff where curse smoke literally starts leaking out of the cracks in its armour. Everything about the Pursuer's design is awesome, from the curse aspect to the sheer heft and weight of its armour and weaponry. The Pursuer's greatshield must be one of the thickest in the trilogy. I was really glad when they brought it back in Dark Souls 3, though it's only known as the Curse Ward greatshield there. Let's have another boss from Elden Ring for number 10, the King of Leyndell and Omen King himself, Morgott, though he is of course first encountered under the pseudonym Margit, just before reaching Stormvale Castle. You might consider it a wee bit weird that I've included Morgott in this list at all, due to the fact that he's not really wearing armour as such, instead favouring a ragged fur cloak, but you can actually buy this cloak for yourself after beating him, and so I consider him fair game. Like most fans of FromSoft, I was very hyped during the run up to the release of Elden Ring, eagerly watching trailers and gameplay footage to drink in what flavour I could before that big day on the 25th of February 2002. Though as it happens, my copy of the game actually arrived in the post on the 24th. I cannot describe the joy I felt upon seeing the postman arrive with a game-shaped parcel that day, but let's not get off track. One of the figures I distinctly remember being both intrigued and frightened by in that early footage was Margit the Fell. What the hell even was he? What was with the cluster of horns protruding from the right side of his head? And what's the deal with that grotesque tail? Well, no. Margit, or rather Morgott, is not strictly a human, and as for the horned growths around its body, well, these are aspects of the Crucible, just like I discussed with the Crucible Knights back at number 15. In the lands between, children born with such growths either have their horns brutally and sometimes lethally removed at birth, are hunted down and slaughtered by cruel smirk-masked omen killers, or, if they are fortunate or perhaps unfortunate enough to have been born into royalty, are left with their horns intact, but kept secluded in the dark depths of the subterranean shunning grounds beneath the royal capital, away from the golden grace of the Erdtree, banished and forgotten, which is where Morgott comes in, being one of two secret sons of the human Godfrey and the goddess Queen Marika, meaning not only is he a royal omen, but that he is in fact a royal omen demigod. This is why he looks so distinct from the game's other omens, who appear that bit more monstrous and bulky, whereas Morgott has a comparatively more regal look about him, though to me that's just served to make him all the more intimidating. Morgott's design is sick in a different way to almost every other entry in my list, because he doesn't have a set of grand armour, complete with a thick great shield and fancy weapon. Instead, his attire is very humble, and the same can even be said for his weapon the first time you encounter him as Margit, though I won't lie, his weapon's true form as the cursed greatsword is anything but humble. That is one of the nicest goddamn sword designs that FromSoft has ever came up with. The appeal of Morgott's design for me is again enhanced by his tragic backstory, all caused by his inhuman appearance, having led a life devoid of the grace of the Erdtree, yet choosing to serve as its protector all the same against those who might seek to do it harm out of their own lust for power. The item description for the Fell Omen Cloak says it best. Having slaughtered countless champions during the Shattering, the Fell Omen has become a horror to those who harbour ambitions for the Erdtree or for lordship. And now we have our first, but not last, proper big boss, presenting Dark Souls 1's Iron Golem, located at the top of Sen's fortress, guarding the way onwards to Anor Londo. I guess you might consider this boss as being more of a machine of sorts than a dude with armour, not unlike the Smelter Demon from Dark Souls 2, and you'd be right. But again, you can obtain Iron Golem's set from Domol of Zera, the same curious merchant who sells other awesome boss armour sets, including those of the aforementioned Artorias and Ornstein. I mentioned that it's fair to see the Iron Golem as something of a machine, and that's because it's true as indicated by the fact that instead of it having a particularly powerful soul, as most of Dark Souls 1's bosses do, the Golem is given animation and power by a special core derived from the bone of an everlasting dragon, all towards the purpose of slaying would-be heroes who might disturb the peace of Anor Londo. What? Me? Disturb the peace? Never. It's that robotic nature that I find so appealing with the Iron Golem. There's no thought or emotion here, there's just an enormous, ultra-heavy hunk of black iron armed with a big bloody axe, and it's here to terminate you, shaking the bridge structure it's situated on with every swing and slam. Even before setting foot through the fog wall, you can just see it standing there, motionless at the other side of the arena, only springing into action when you step through to challenge it. Sadly, the actual level of challenge provided by this fight doesn't really come close to matching the badassery of its design, but even so, I've always found it to just be really memorable, and an excellent precursor to Anor Londo. There's no deep backstory here, there's no emotional baggage, it's just a big dude made of metal. But I'm not done talking about supermassive metal monsters just yet, folks, because for number 8 I have chosen Demon Souls Tower Knight, the single largest boss in this entire list. Boletaria happens to be my favourite world in Demon Souls, and as such I have very high opinions of all 4 of its levels, like its second level which requires traversal both on and through a long stone bridge, whilst being assaulted with regular bursts of dragon fire, but the cherry on the cake, for me, is when I make it to the other end to witness the absurd size and power of the Tower Knight. One area where it does somewhat differ in character compared to the machine-like Iron Golem is that the Tower Knight is actually a demon, though in practice that doesn't really make it feel any less machine-like in its movements and design. You fight the Black Phantom of Alfred, Knight of the Tower, which the boss is based on at the start of the King's Tower level, essentially appearing as a regular-sized copy of its demonic avatar, except armed with a scraping spear instead of the one the boss uses. I mean, if I was rating Alfred on the scale of sickness, then suffice to say he would not be appearing in the top 15, but do the old click and drag on him, just like old Uncle Ornstein, and I'll start singing a different song, because I am nothing if not a sucker for a big heavy boss in armour, one that makes the ground shake with its footsteps, one which causes violent blue fulminations upon driving its enormous shield into the ground, and one with the ability to hurl huge spectral spears at you from below which, even though they literally always miss, still look sick. Speaking of the soul magic aspect, a highly aesthetically pleasing visual flourish I really enjoyed in the 2020 remake is how sprays of blue soul power jet out of its ankles and feet upon being hit, making it feel like what you're fighting is just a massive set of armour literally filled with pressurised concentrated magic, merely imitating the form and movements of a human, and standing sentinel here at the end of the Lord's path to prevent further passage onto the inner ward, and then finally the Demon King Alant. Once again I have another big ass boss to talk about, the one far smaller than either the Iron Golem or Tower Knight. Mind you, for what Small lacks in size when compared to those two, he more than makes up for in cruelty and brutality. There's something about helmets which mimic the form of a face that I find so intimidating. I briefly talked about it with the Looking Glass Knight's helmet, but whereas that boss looked perpetually passive, Small looks somewhat more expressive and pissed off. Of course, nowadays it's no secret that the face and head on top of his armour is merely a distracting decoration designed to intimidate his victims, with Small's eyes instead looking out from the 2 holes at the bottom of his neck and above his tits, which are pretty bloody intimidating in their own right. These odd features of his make him a fantastic visual complement to Ornstein, whose design is far more jagged and refined when compared to the brutal golden enormity of Smo, who, rather than using a slender spear with dexterity and skill as Ornstein does, instead wields an absurdly large hammer, which happens to be by far the heaviest weapon in Dark Souls 1 by the way. In fact, it's heavier than Havel's Dragon Tooth by more than 50%. The face transition cutscene is particularly excellent at showcasing Smo's brutality. If you nail Smo first, then Ornstein absorbs his giant ally's energy, gaining the power and size of a giant himself, somehow. There doesn't seem to be any malice or pleasure in this action, it's simply done as a necessary step to take down the undead invader who has made it into the heart of the castle. If you take out Ornstein first though, then Smo doesn't even give it 10 seconds before slamming down his giant hammer onto his partner's still lightly breathing body, obliterating it to absorb his vitality and lightning energy. There are very interesting possible subtexts for this too, like how even though they're both fighting side by side in this hall, which lies before the princess's chamber, unlike Ornstein, Smo was never actually one of Gwyn's 4 knights, being denied this honour due to his cannibalistic tendencies, wherein he would eat the remains of his executed victims, and Smo's complete lack of hesitation upon seeing Ornstein weakened here could have been spurred on by jealousy. Or maybe he just loves killing. Draw your own conclusions. For number 6, we have our first entry from Dark Souls 3, and our first female entry too. Ooh la la! Introducing the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, another big boss, and the first one that people were allowed to see in action from the game prior to its release, though she was known as the Dancer of the Frigid Valley back then. I think FromSoft made the perfect boss choice to showcase their game to the public, because the Dancer must be one of their all-time most twisted, eerie designs. Of course, she's befallen a similar fate to the other beings from the Boreal Valley, like Vort and the Outrider Knights, who would eventually be transformed from noble knights into wild, frigid beasts, bounding around on all fours like rabid dogs and enveloping the Pontiff's enemies in damaging frost. The Dancer is comparatively less bestial, still retaining some of her original grace in her movements. Rather than walking on all fours, she more undulates around the arena in quiet whispering motions in a way that just looks wrong, proportionally and gravitationally. In fact, I never made this connection before until the time of writing, but the way Sekiro's headless ape moves is essentially a faster, more pronounced version of the Dancer's movements. As with many of FromSoft's most interesting boss designs, this one is enhanced by the tragic element around it, because her appearance isn't far gone enough that you can't imagine what she might have looked like previously. In fact, she was originally the distant daughter of Irithel's former royal family, and yet now she's been cruelly devolved into a mindless looming horror, her formerly noble features now obscured behind a dark veil, and a good thing too, because on closer inspection she looks half a corpse. All very messed up, but hey, it's the messed up characters, bosses and concepts that make these games so damn compelling. At number 5 we have another boss from Dark Souls 3, and in fact it's one which shares some similarities with the Dancer, also having experienced something of a fall from grace. At the very top of Lothric Castle, past the Winged Knights, Lothric Knights and Pilgrim Butterflies, Prince Lothric and his elder brother Prince Lorien await the end of the world, having rejected the linking of the fire just like the other Lords of Cinder. Despite having been expected to become a royal champion, Prince Lothric ended up being perpetually thin and feeble, not strong enough to wear armour, and certainly not strong enough to wield his holy sword, blessed by Emma yet never used, but alongside Lothric, lurking in a dark corner, is Lorien, Elder Prince. Just like the Dancer of the Boreal Valley was cruelly transformed into an inhuman monstrosity over time, this is partly true of Prince Lorien, who was a royal champion, tall, strong and broad, a warrior who single-handedly slayed the demon prince with his greatsword, leading to its scorched appearance and imbuing it with the power of fire. However, by the time we see him here, Lorien is crawling on all fours, having lost the use of his legs as well as the power of speech, now only being capable of producing tortured noises from his throat. Furthermore, he seems to be essentially blind, judging by the form of his helm, which does not appear to have any actual eye holes, perhaps because he no longer requires them in his diminished state. Both Lorien and Lothric also have this unpleasant, deathly, pale look about their skin, not quite to the extent where they look hollow, but where they don't exactly look fully alive in the conventional sense, as per the curse which binds their souls to one another, the curse which sacrificed Lorien's mobility and speech to imbue Lothric with the strength to become a Lord of Cinder, a responsibility which he and his brother ultimately rejected. Honestly, I think the way Lorien's affliction is used in this fight is pure genius, with both princes working in tandem to combat the player. Lorien has the size and strength to fight us, still partially retaining his former combat abilities, though lacking the mobility needed for the battle, and so from above his brother teleports him around the room towards us, sometimes mid-attack. By far my favourite move of Lorien's though is the one where he tries to stand up to his full height, only partially managing it before crashing his blade down at the player with the momentum from the movement. It's an amazing fight, and in fact I genuinely consider it to be one of the top 5 greatest bosses from any FromSoft game, but like I said in the intro, the actual quality of the fight isn't relevant for my choices here. The fact is though that the design and concept behind this boss plays a massive part in making it such a quality encounter. The cursed nature of the Twin Princes, Lorien especially makes this a powerful and emotional battle with these two cursed, crippled beings secluded in this high chamber, not only waiting for the end of the world, but welcoming it. Well, I couldn't very well make a video on sickest armoured boss designs without including General Radahn, could I? FromSoft are masters at building anticipation for coming boss fights, and they do a lot in Elden Ring, giving you bits of information on coming demigods to the point where you're dying to see them in the flesh in all their godly glory. This is absolutely the case with Radahn, who's referred to by several characters as being the strongest of all the demigods, the one who brought Malenia's Scarlet Rot to a standstill at Caelid, though as we learn during Jeren's rousing speech prior to the Radahn festival, this encounter came at great cost, divorcing the demigod of his intellect and rotting him from the inside, leaving him a hulking red beast, wandering the Caelid shores in search of remaining corpses to gorge upon, the corpses of his fallen comrades. It all builds the hype so damn hard, and it just builds all the more as you descend that slow lift down to the beach, letting you cast your eyes over the vast red arena where the battle is to take place, under a scarlet sky, before entering through the portal. I think the most fitting adjective to describe Radahn's design is mighty. Every aspect of him exhibits a towering might that still very much remains even despite how terribly we are told the Scarlet Rot has crippled him, which just makes him come across as even more impossibly formidable, that even despite the appalling conditions this fallen demigod has been living in for who knows how many decades, or perhaps centuries, the second he's threatened by an opponent or opponents, his old combat senses instantly click back into gear, resulting in sequences of savage bladed twirls and violent violet shockwaves. I especially love the less overt details of Radahn's design, like how he no longer has any feet, with him having been ground away to discoloured stumps from him having dragged across the coarse Caelid sands for so long, and no doubt the Scarlet Rot, which he's afflicted with, also has something to do with this deformity. Then you've got the arsenal of spears and swords still firmly lodged into his back, morbid war trophies delivered during his original battle with Malenia, though clearly not having bothered him in the slightest, to the point where they simply look like armour decorations. The extravagant shock of red hair coming from his helm is also a key element of his design, this being something of a tribute to his red-haired father, Radagon, and one which gives him a distinctly leonine look, though the single most enjoyable and endearing detail, the one which everyone loves him for, is his wee horsey, Leonard. The poor ragged creature still serving his beloved master after all this time, only being capable of carrying Radahn's immense weight via the demigod's telekinetic powers, and Radahn will sometimes even stomp Leonard into the sand to keep him out of the path of his next massive attack. The horse aspect of Radahn's design makes his movement look incredibly unique, because he effectively drifts around the arena for many of his attacks, enhancing the build-up and anticipation during the wind-up before the attack is unleashed, obliterating you and any other NPC phantom caught in their path. What more can you say about Radahn? He's sick as hell. And to kick off the top 3, I have selected Sir Alon from Dark Souls 2's Crown of the Old Iron King DLC. Now, Sir Alon may not be as big and fierce as General Radahn, but it's not all about size, because grace and dexterity can be even more effective attributes when it comes to awesome boss designs. Funnily enough, I actually consider the memory of the Old Iron King, which leads directly up to the Sir Alon fight, to be the single worst level of any Souls game, but once you actually make it through the fog wall, that all changes when you see this imposing, densely armoured samurai armed with an odachi, sitting calmly in this absolute stunner of a boss arena. I know I'm ranking the boss designs here, but god damn, this arena looks good too. perfectly complementing the graceful appearance of Sir Alon himself. Obviously all these games are made in Japan, but for the most part they're very light on Eastern themes and concepts, instead drawing far more from Western themes and designs, but for me that just makes it feel extra special when a character or weapon with a far more Japanese flavour does appear. I mean, Shiva from the East from Dark Souls 1 is the most obvious example, but when you get to the Iron Keep in Dark Souls 2's base game, the place is absolutely lousy with Alon Knights and Alon Captains, armed with black steel katanas who move and attack with a very different style to almost any other enemy in the game. And this is because they were trained by an unusual warrior from the Far East, one who would become the old Iron King's most trusted knight, of course referring to Sir Alon. I just love seeing the way this boss moves, his long wind-ups followed by quick and sudden stabs and slices, and although their designs are very different, Sir Alon even has a similarity to the Pursuer, also having a special thrust attack that imbues him with a special buff for a time afterwards, though dealing bleed damage instead of curse. I really love that they gave him an adachi rather than a katana like his knights have, because there's no other weapon like this in the game, and it serves to make his design even more distinctive, and his moveset all the more threatening. One of the coolest aspects of the fight is that if you're skilled enough to nail him without taking a single lick of damage, you get to see a secret death animation where he commits seppuku. And for me, hidden details and touches like this go such a long way towards creating memorable boss encounters. At number 2, I have chosen Velstadt, the Royal Aegis from Dark Souls 2. The Undead Crypt is a dark, gloomy level filled with hollows, witches and ominous hooded pyromancers, but through the very end of a long hall guarded by many Cyan Knights and a Dragon Rider, the Royal Aegis awaits, kneeling beneath the single remaining spot of sunlight in the room, standing as the final bulwark protecting King Vendrick. Velstadt's armour and weapon are very reminiscent of some previous pieces of equipment in the Souls games, with his helm and weapon being similar in style to those used by Garl Vinland from Demon Souls, and Velstadt's bell chime hammer also looks similar to Paladin Leroy's Grant from Dark Souls 1, which, like the bell chime hammer, also requires some investment into the faith stat. As with many of my favourite Dark Souls boss designs, it's Velstadt's size that really seals the deal. Insanely cool armour set and weapon, but the fact that he's at least 3 times the height of the player and over twice as wide makes him look so much more formidable. He's this unyielding bronze titan armed with a colossal holy hammer, tasked with his singular duty to guard his king, or at least what remains of his king. You can even catch sight of Velstadt standing in the same place if you enter the memory of Vendrick. It's the dark element that really elevates the intrigue of this character for me. Of course, you see him kneeling in the light upon entering, yet despite this, in Phase 2 he rings the sacred chime within his hammer, calling upon the power of the dark to finish the job, with both he himself and his weapon having been corrupted by the dark due to their extended exposure here in the Undead Crypt, to the extent that even Velstadt's soul has become soaked through with the dark despite his efforts to remain a pure Aegis. I said it before and I'll say it again, love it or hate it, Dark Souls 2 has some of the best looking armoured bosses of any FromSoft game. A few honourable mentions from the game that didn't quite make it into the list were the Dragon Rider, the Burnt Ivory King, and both the Throne Defender and Watcher. I also thought about putting the Smelter Demon here because, I mean, you can get its armour, but as gnarly and demonic a design as it certainly has, I just don't think it's interesting enough to make it into the top 15. Which brings us on to my pick for number 1. And that pick is the Dragon Slayer armour from Dark Souls 3, the iron entity barring the way onto the Grand Archives and upwards onto the Twin Princes' chambers. I did of course have Dragon Slayer Ornstein back at number 12, who sports one of the most iconic and recognisable designs in the Dark Souls trilogy, especially when set alongside Executioner Smo, but the Dragon Slayer armour takes that original design and twists and warps it, makes it more monstrous, heavy and powerful, and damn well electrifying. There's no grace in either its fighting style or its choice of weapons, with its great shield being little more than a massive hunk of iron melted into shape. And you can say much the same about its massive great axe, which is imbued with lightning, the same lightning used by its former owner many ages ago to slay dragons. Of course, whoever its owner was is long since gone, with the armour now being possessed by a singularly large pilgrim butterfly who can be seen floating upwards at the start of the fight, before periodically firing murky red projectiles at the arena from afar. All the while this warped, metallic monstrosity unrelentingly hammers and cleaves throughout the arena. It's a truly amazing encounter with what I consider to be the single sickest looking armoured boss of any FromSoft game, unless you get killed right at the very end like I did here, in which case it sucks. Mind you, you can't actually get this armour for yourself in the base game until the second encounter with it in the swamps of the Ringed City, where it is laying discarded and motionless for untold ages before abruptly coming back to life, though there's no pilgrim butterfly possessing it here. Rather, it's as if the very memory of its last encounter with the player in Lothric Castle, who knows how long ago, is enough to give it animation for one final fight. I've always found something very powerful about this encounter with it. Just the way it all happens with no fanfare or even musical accompaniment. The armour just senses the player's approach and instantly comes to life, here in this dark, rotting swamp at the end of the world. It's brilliant stuff and a great reuse of a top tier boss. Well, there you have it folks, there's my top 15 picks. I'm sure many of you noticed that Bloodborne was conspicuously absent here, and I really do wish I could have included one or two of its bosses, but for as cool as the likes of Father Gascoigne and Lady Maria look, for me they just didn't quite make the cut in terms of sick designs. Like I said though, I'll also be putting out a top 15 monster boss designs video too, and although at the time of writing I haven't yet put together my list for that, I think it's fair to say you can expect that to be a very Bloodborne heavy video. Before I leave, please allow me to give a final fond thank you to my kind patrons for their support for the channel. And on that note, cheers for watching and cheerio.